Okay, we've got some New England settlers occupying the township they've been assigned, overlapping just a little. They'll select a site for their village and, working together, cut down some trees and build their houses. What they're doing is reproducing village life back as they knew it back in England. Um, so it looks very much like an English village. It's not laid out in a geometric grid or anything, just some houses here and some houses there. And um, the two that are farthest apart, probably no more than about half a mile apart. Plus, they will cooperate in building their meeting house. That's where they have their church services and, from time to time, their town meetings where they govern themselves through direct democracy. While they're doing that, they are dividing up the land that they intend to cultivate. They're not going to cultivate all of it. What they do intend to cultivate will be apportioned out among the families. And since these are Europeans who came from a culture where um, social, where some people outranked others, that's a given. It doesn't cross their mind to question that. The only thing they haggle about is who outranks whom. But the families regarded as having the highest status will get more land. The families who have less status will get less land. Okay? So the remaining land remains the property of the group as such, and it's referred to as the common land because they own it in common. And that's for anybody's use. You can gather firewood there, you can hunt, you can fish if there's a stream, cut wood if you happen to want to, have a picnic, whatever. So that's township life. Um, anyway, I think. Oh, if you came as an individual or just a family, not already part of a group, one way to acquire land would be to somehow be voted in by an existing town that's already up and running. That could be like pledging a fraternity. Okay, they're not likely to let you in if they think you might challenge the prevailing beliefs and the prevailing culture. But you'd have to be voted in by a town. There are, if I'm correctly informed, rural villages in New England to this day where you could compare the names on the 17th century tombstones in the churchyard, the family names that is, with the family names in the latest version of the phone book, and you'd find pretty much the same family names. And they've been there now for coming up on 400 years, and they know who they are, and they're all interrelated. And if your family's only been there for 6 generations, 550 years, something like that, you are still something of a newcomer. So we don't really have anything like that in much more recently settled parts of the country like the one we live in. So the township system gives you highly functional communities right from the start, maybe a little bit too functional for our taste. They do have tightly held culture, and they believe that the good of the community rests on the good of the households that make up the community. And if there were reports or rumors of dysfunction, say spousal abuse or neglect or something like that, the town leaders would not be hesitant about stepping in and trying to set things right. Okay, we're now going to turn our attention to colonial government. This is going to come in two different packages, or two different potential questions. There will be the structure of government question, and there will be the imperial administration question. First, structure of government. And now we've left just New England. We're looking at all of the colonies, 12 of them until the 1730s when Georgia made 13. Okay, by the 1720s, the typical structure of an English colony on the mainland is they're all fairly similar to each other in main outline. Now there have been extremely thick, dull, dry, boring books written about the differences, but the differences do not concern us at this level, fortunately. We're looking at the similarities. This is important, as I'll tell you again later, because if the first 13 states, when the time came to set up an overall government for all 13, a United States government, if they had had widely varying structures or forms of government before that, you can forget about them agreeing on the structure of a national government. The fact that they're all, just blow your eyes a little bit, they're all pretty much alike, that helped a lot. So, what was this structure? There are three components, each of them reflecting to one degree or another the structure of the English government back home. Okay, each of the 13 colonies is headed up by a chief executive who bears the title of governor. This is from the very beginning. The first settlers that built Jamestown had a governor. At that time, the term meant just an administrator or a supervisor. So, and his function reflected that of the king in England. The next component, we'll look at each of these in detail after I get all three of them lined out. Next would be one which by the 18th century is a bit harder to generalize about. It's whatever power it had once had was largely gone. It was more ceremonial than anything, but each colony except Pennsylvania had a governor's council. Okay, Council. They have a council, which very vaguely reflected the role of the House of Lords, the upper house of the English Parliament. And each of the 13 colonies had an elected representative assembly. Okay? Council and assembly, these are generic terms. They might have specific names in specific colonies. For example, in Massachusetts, the assembly was the General Court. In Virginia, it's the House of Burgesses, and so on. So, we'll go back and look at the role of the governor. All right? High school government textbooks, I don't know if they still do, they did when I was teaching that, made really too much out of three types of colonies, as they called it, because there were three different ways a colonial governor might get his job. Okay? Although none of the 13 colonies started out as royal colonies, directly the property of the king, 8 of them had become royal colonies by late in the colonial period, and in each case, the king appointed the governor. Now, there's a little bit more technicality to that, but we'll leave it at that for right now. We'll look at the English end of this under imperial administration. Okay, there were 3 colonies which belonged to certain families in England. Pennsylvania and Delaware both belonged to the descendants of William Penn. They are proprietary colonies, along with Maryland, which belonged to the Calvert family, in which case the proprietor, the owner of the colony, would appoint the governor. And 2 colonies, which were next door to each other, both small and insignificant. Sorry, guys. Both chartered in 1662, Rhode Island and Connecticut, and their charters permitted them to elect their own governor. So they're called charter colonies. Anyway, where the royal colonies are concerned at least, the reason the governor's role reflects that of the king in England is because he's appointed by the king through some flunkies he had working for him that actually picked people for that job. And let's say you're the royal governor of Virginia, that's a plum assignment. When you get here, you carry with you the authority of the king. You represent the king. When you speak, it's as if the king has spoken. If you act, it is as if the king has acted. And you have a fairly standard package of powers. You can summon the assembly. You can dismiss the assembly if you get tired of them. You can, unfortunately, or maybe unfortunately, we don't have this anymore, you may prorogue the assembly. There's a new word. That's where you tell the assembly, okay, guys, we're going to reset all the counters to 0 and start over. Well, you can enforce laws selectively. You can grant pardons and paroles. You are the commander-in-chief of the colony's militia, and you're authorized to do anything that just appears to need doing. Now, today, there are people that think if something needs doing, it's constitutional, which is, we need to go back and get that one. It's not necessarily the case. So, the royal governor, plus if the king wants to announce something or tell something or proclaim some policy to the people in a given colony, the governor, as his appointee, will be his mouthpiece for that. Governors tended to be somebody's relative. Okay, there's some political debts being paid off. We'll appoint your cousin to be governor of whatever it is in exchange for a debt. They are often retired army officers who are set up with a good retirement here. So, and they learn pretty quickly you got to go along to get along. Because just as in England during the timeline of the colonial period, the powers of the king declined and declined. I mean, in the early 1600s, when the first colonies were being set up, the king was, if they'd been smarter and more ruthless, somebody like James I or Charles I could emerge as effective dictators. Before that century was over, one king had lost a civil war and had his head chopped off, and another one had simply been fired by Parliament. Parliament had officially taken over the exercise of the royal power, kept the king around for symbolic purposes, and put him on an allowance. So governors should understand they can't just get off the boat and start barking orders. They have to be effective politicians if they're going to succeed. They have to figure out who their normal allies are and keep them happy. They have to go along to get along. And one other little thing here. Although you represent the king does not pay you a salary. You could be the royal governor of Virginia. That's a big job. But the king doesn't pay you anything. The colony of Virginia pays you your salary. As we'll get to the assembly in a minute, that's part of what the assembly does. They not only set the tax rate and all that, they vote the salaries for everybody from the governor down to local magistrates. So you can't alienate those guys. Okay? And this is bleeding over. This is two components at once, so think of it mainly from the governor's standpoint. If he screws up bad enough, the assembly could rattle his chain by threatening to withhold his pay. And if he screws up some more, they can actually withhold his pay, and that happened occasionally. But those are limitations on the power of governor. Okay, next up, the colonies, each one except Pennsylvania, had a governor's council. That's an appointive advisory body. Again, the term council is generic. And there'd been a time when it had quite a bit of power. It's tempting to think of it as the upper house of a two-house legislature, with the assembly being the lower house. That doesn't happen enough for it to be a solid generalization. But the members are appointed. They're usually 12 men who serve for life once they're appointed, and they're chosen from the very top rank of society in the colony. If you're a member of the governor's council, you can write home to your mom and tell her you made it, because that's as high as the ladder goes. Because no local person's going to be the governor unless you live in Rhode Island and Connecticut, and that's not many folks live there. So, as I say, the council was, the functions varied. Sometimes they had say-so on whether a law passed by the assembly could proceed or not. Sometimes they served as a court. In Virginia, the governor's council was the highest court. Only the governor's council could inflict the death penalty. So if there's a capital crime that took place in Virginia, there'd be a county court procedure, not to determine guilt or innocence, but like a grand jury today, its function would be to determine whether it thought there was enough evidence against the accused to put them on trial before the governor's council. Obviously, they're not having trials like this all the time. But then if they thought so, then the governor's council would hear the case and render a verdict. So that leaves the assembly. That's a bigger deal, and we'll come back to that in part 7. Tiny note, the function of the governor's council vaguely reflected that of the House of Lords. That's the upper house of the English Parliament, membership in which was hereditary. But that comparison falls apart pretty quickly.